I'd like to look at two hexagrams today, 27 and 28. The first thing I want to point out that I think is really interesting about this pair is that we have all four terrestrial elements present. There's earth over fire and water over air. In hexagram 27, which is sometimes called eating or nourishment, we have that earth element over the fire. And the image is describing fiery change at the foot of a mountain. Earth is over fire, I think literally of the idea of cooking, right? So that the title eating makes sense. It goes very hand in hand with the concept of cooking. We cook with fire. The things that we cook are of the earth. And cooking is this chemical transformation, that fiery change at the foot of the mountain, right? So, and where like what we eat, the things that we cook and eat, every bite we are choosing is literally transforming us, right? And then in hexagram 28, we have excess or critical mass, which is that water element over the air element. And the image describes a flood or a forest drowned by a flood, right? Excess is water over air, those emotional and intellectual aspects of our being, but literally water and trees, which sometimes that element air is translated as tree. Water gives nourishment to trees, but in this case, the water is covering or drowning, killing the trees, which kind of is that overeating idea, right? It has a similar effect when we eat too much. So that's kind of the first level of meaning, right? On this hexagram pair, we're seeing this concept that we need to consider carefully what it is that we consume and recognize when we've consumed enough. A little bit deeper, there's another layer, right? There's always going to be some more layers, is recognizing that eating is more than just food. All sources of nourishment are included in this idea, this concept: physical, spiritual, time, words, relationships, and so forth. It's all about choosing where you spend your energy to nourish rather than deplete yourself. And so, on that same level, that critical mass aspect, right, means recognizing that a situation or conditions have reached their tipping point. There is this phrase in here that's kind of like the beam sags from the weight: move now or be crushed. So excess is recognizing this imbalance or overabundance of something and taking action to avoid the collapse by either removing yourself or redistributing that weight somehow. So just analyzing this to this point right here, I'm kind of like, okay, we're talking about boundaries, which is sort of my main work that I discovered kind of over the last several years, in combination of working with a Swami and a counselor. And then my Plum Blossom reading really kind of nailed in the message that boundaries are my work, my big work. And so I've also done a talk I haven't recorded here, but I'm going to recap a little from that talk that I have done on boundaries. Boundaries serve exactly two purposes, two. The first is to sort of cut off or sort out, separate from, and the second is to hold together, prevent those pieces from getting lost. So, in order to have boundaries, you need some sort of rule about what you're protecting or keeping together and what you're sorting out or keeping away. And this rule can be of principles, morals, values, virtues. It can be really anything you want, right? But that's how you know where to set your boundary. And then, of course, once you have the rule by which you're deciding what to keep in and what to keep out, you need enforcement of that rule, or I like to use the word protection of that rule. So in the case of hexagram 27 and 28, we're given a rule, and the rule is nourishment. Does it nourish or does it not? I value time that I spend with people or activities that nourish me. And so protecting that boundary means when something asks for my time to be used in a way that corrupts my nourishment, I say no. The sort of shadow side of this is when you're taking in too many things, right? You're not discriminating what you're letting in to influence you. You're not discerning between what is true and false or what is healthy or unhealthy, right? And so I actually, when I discovered that boundaries was my work, and that eating was the nuclear hexagram in my plum blossom reading, I selected it as sort of like a shadow ritual. And at that point in time, I was really stretching myself too thin. I was giving a lot of time and energy away without taking really a moment to pause and determine what was the most valuable or nourishing place to give my time. And I was feeling pretty out of control with my eating habits as well. It was all together, right? And since doing that sort of shadow ritual, I have been making choices that in every way are more nourishing for me, that are energizing me, including a health streak and being intentional in my relationships and my career paths and all kinds of stuff. And so that's one way that these things can, studying these hexagrams can inform our lives, right? So there's another layer, another deeper layer in this pair of hexagrams. It was kind of a surprise to me when I went on this journey of analyzing to discover that one more layer, right? And that's about facing the past and standing up for what you know is right. Uh, and this eating nourishment part is the facing the past part of that, right? So everything from our past, um, that feeds us. It feeds us whether or not it's nourishing us, right? It is the root source of nourishment. Who we are, our former selves, our ancestors, cultural history. These are things that if we don't look at them, turn around and face them, um, we will. There are corrupt patterns back there in those roots that are poison can be poisoning us, right? So the opposite of nourishing us. And so when we finally do turn to have a look and find that corruption, those results, those patterns that are sort of having emanations further down the line in our lives today, generational trauma, cultural trauma, um, when we have a look at how they're affecting our spiritual nourishment, we can find the corruption, right? We can find this blockage of the free flow of this, this inspiring energy that could be the free flow of nourishment from the good places, right? So how do we heal? How do we heal those corruptions so that root from which we're pulling our nourishment is not poisoned, is not pulling in poison, right? And what we do there is we have to renew our sources of spiritual nourishment. We got to connect to deep truth and wisdom. And there's a word for this, a phrase. It's called eating ancient virtue. And in line 5 of this hexagram, we have the tiger described as this adept hunter on the mountain, right? And we met the tiger back when we started our journey in hexagram 10, if you'll recall that pair analysis. And now this tiger is doing the work of eating that corruption of the past within us, right? So that's another eating, right? Eating is the name of this nourishment. These are the titles for this hexagram. And so one way that we kind of transform this sort of abstract awareness of, oh, there's this thing in my past, there's this cultural trauma, this person who had an effect way back here, who's now a hungry ghost and is haunting me. When we have this abstract awareness of it, how can we transform that into self-cultivation? And that is really, it kind of looks like intentionally seeking out a more nourishing narrative, reframing that narrative, rewriting our story, being nourishing, being intentional and nourishing in our own actions and the things that we do, actually does the same thing. Because if we're not intentional in our actions and what we think and do and say, then this person who has this reverberation is controlling those actions and feelings, right? But if we're like, oh, I'm not going to let that control me, I have reframed that narrative, and now it is a source of power in my life. That's being intentional, right? That's correcting that corruption, and correcting that flow of nourishment from the roots, so that it meets our needs rather than poisons. And ultimately helps us to develop and discover this sort of deeper, higher self that needs to be tended to and nurtured and within us, right? And on the other side of that whole process, of course, I haven't talked about excess, right? And well, this may inspire us to face the past, but excess moves us to stand up for what is right. So that is that choice, that intentional choice, rather than passively letting that root being poisoned. We are choosing to correct it, and stand up for what is right. It's sort of that active phase of the process. So critical mass represents the tipping point, this crisis that's created by this inappropriate concentration of mass. And at one level, that is that overweight person being like, gosh, I have to take a diet or I might die. Or it's recognizing you have too many things in your life right now and you can't sustain it. Your structure is in danger of collapsing. This realization that beam is sagging moves you to kind of get out of the way before you're crushed, before the dam bursts and the flood sweeps you away. But on this eating ancient virtue side of things, it's a little different. This one has a kind of nuanced meaning that you might not expect. So this is where there's this sort of radical and imperative action urged by the commentaries. Like, you have to be decisive and not impulsive. And there's sort of this question of like, how are we to be decisive, but rather than impulsive in a crisis? And the way that you do that is you have to locate your principles, your virtues, right? Which kind of goes back to that boundaries thing. What is the guide? And you have to locate those virtues. You got to take in and all the learning and growth that you've done so far, right? And allow them to flow through you in order to address the need. And so in this case, that thing that has reached critical mass is the consumption of ancient virtue. It's the learning and the growth. You can't fit one more bite of delicious, nutritious, spiritual food into you without letting it flow out into the world. There's no way. It's just going to vomit right out of you, basically. So it's understanding that in this moment, you are ready to face your challenge, to fix that sagging beam, right? You don't need to wait or learn or grow anymore. In fact, if you don't act now, your resources and your progress so far are at risk of rotting. There's going to be a drowning of the clarity of all the insight and revelation that you have received. And so that's sort of what these two have to teach us.